Every personality test you've ever taken at work was probably wrong, and you loved it anyway. That eerie feeling of accuracy has a name. It's called the Barnum effect. It's named after P.T. Barnum, the showman famous for his slogan about a sucker being born every minute. The term describes something specific. Vague, generic statements feel deeply personal when you believe they were written just for you. Your brain does the rest of the work. It fills in the details, connects the dots, makes the description fit. This isn't a flaw in your personality test. It's a design feature, and it's older than any HR department, dating back long before anyone thought to put it on a slide deck. The clearest proof of this comes from a psychologist named Bertram Forer. In 1948, Forer ran a simple experiment on a group of his students. He gave them a personality test, a real one, with real questions about their habits, preferences, and self-image. Students filled it out carefully, assuming their answers would shape whatever came back. Forer collected the answer sheets, disappeared for a bit, and returned a few days later with a personalized write-up for each student. He told them the description had been built specifically from their answers. That framing mattered. Believing the report was personal is what made the whole thing work. Except none of it was actually personalized. Every single student received the exact same paragraph of text, word for word, regardless of what they had answered, regardless of who they were. The paragraph was carefully built to sound specific without actually being specific. It said things like, "You have a need for other people to like you, yet you tend to be critical of yourself." It said the person had unused capacity that hadn't been turned to their advantage. It describes someone who is disciplined and self-controlled on the outside, but who worries and feels insecure on the inside. It mentioned that at times the person is extroverted, sociable, and outgoing, while at other times they are introverted, cautious, and reserved. None of it was drawn from any actual test data. It was one generic script, copy-pasted for every student in the room, regardless of how carefully they had answered the earlier questions. Forer then asked his students to rate how accurate the description was, on a scale, for describing them personally. The average rating came out to roughly 85% accuracy. 85% for a document that had nothing to do with any individual answer, handed out identically to every single person in the class. Almost nobody guessed the trick. Every student in that room was reading the same paragraph as everyone else, and almost everyone was convinced it had been written specifically about them. This is the experiment the entire Barnum effect rests on. It's been replicated many times since 1948, in different countries, with different tests, different professions, different age groups. The results hold up remarkably well. People consistently rate vague, generic personality descriptions as highly accurate, as long as they believe the description was generated specifically for them. Change that one belief, and the accuracy ratings drop sharply. The content never changes in these follow-up studies. Only the perceived authorship does, which tells you exactly where the accuracy was actually coming from all along. So why does this work? The mechanism has a few moving parts, and none of them require the underlying test to be good or even to exist. First, the statements are vague on purpose, whether or not the test designer meant it that way. "You have a need for other people to like you" is true of almost every functioning adult. "You tend to be critical of yourself" describes most people who've ever had a bad performance review, a rough Monday, or an ordinary case of self-doubt. These aren't insights. They're safe bets, dressed up as observations, phrased with just enough confidence to sound earned. Second, the statements are specific sounding, even though they aren't specific in substance. There's a difference between vague content and vague phrasing. Forer's paragraph didn't say, "You're a normal person." It said things with texture, contrast, and apparent nuance. Disciplined outside, insecure inside. Sociable sometimes, reserved other times. Driven, but occasionally impatient. That kind of phrasing feels like it required real data to produce. It didn't. It just required someone who understood how people read about themselves, and who knew which contradictions feel true to almost anyone alive. Third, and this is the part that does the real damage, once you believe a statement is about you, your brain goes looking for evidence that confirms it. Psychologists call this subjective validation. You don't objectively check whether the statement fits the way you'd check a measurement against a ruler. You scan your memory for a moment where it clearly did fit, find one almost instantly because the statement was built to apply to nearly anyone, and treat that one match as proof of the whole profile. Confirming evidence feels like discovery. It's actually just selective memory doing what selective memory always does, which is favor whatever story it's already been told to look for. Fourth, the whole package arrives with an authority signal attached. A credentialed psychologist, a branded assessment platform, a corporate HR system, all of it borrows the same trick professional fortune tellers use, sometimes called cold reading. Present a confident-sounding, plausible statement, delivered by someone with apparent expertise, and the audience does the work of finding the fit themselves. The reader supplies the specificity. The test just supplies the shape, and lets the reader's own life fill in every gap left over. Put those four things together, and you get a machine for manufacturing false accuracy, vague enough to always technically apply, specific sounding enough to feel earned, delivered with enough authority to disable skepticism, and a reader whose brain is actively working to confirm it, not test it. None of those four ingredients require malice from the people running the assessment. Most HR teams buying these tools believe in them sincerely, which is part of why the pattern is so durable. Now here's where this stops being trivia and starts being expensive. Companies spend real money on personality assessments, not pocket change either. Hiring pipelines, team-building retreats, leadership development programs, succession planning, all of it routes through some version of a personality framework. And in every one of those settings, the exact same Forer mechanism is running quietly in the background, mostly invisible, mostly unquestioned, mostly trusted more than it has actually earned. Start with hiring. A candidate takes an assessment as part of the interview process. The result comes back describing someone who is driven, but occasionally impatient, or collaborative, but needs space to recharge. Read in isolation, that sounds like a precise diagnosis of one specific human being. It isn't. It's true of most working adults on the planet. Ambition paired with occasional impatience is not a rare personality signature. It's closer to a description of anyone who has ever had a job and cared about doing it well. But because the report arrives formatted, branded, and delivered with confidence, next to a percentile score and a chart, it gets treated as a verdict rather than a horoscope with better typesetting. Second scenario, and this one is easy to miss because it feels harmless, even fun, team-building workshops. A facilitator brings in a personality framework, maybe color-coded, maybe animal-based, maybe a 4-letter or 16 type system. Everyone takes the assessment before lunch. Everyone gets a type by the afternoon session. The room spends an hour nodding at slides that describe their type as results-oriented, but can come across as blunt, or supportive but conflict-avoidant. People bond over the results. They laugh. They say things like, "That's so me." They compare types with the coworker at the next table. What they're actually experiencing is a room full of people undergoing the Forer effect at the same time, which makes it feel even more convincing, because now it's socially confirmed too. Nobody in the room is checking whether their type description would also apply to the person sitting 2 seats over. It almost always would, if anyone bothered to check. Third scenario, 360-degree feedback reports. These are supposed to be different because they're built from real input, from actual colleagues, actual direct reports, actual observations gathered over months. But by the time that raw feedback gets synthesized into a polished written report, it frequently gets smoothed into the same kind of generic phrasing Forer used. Communicates well but can be perceived as overly direct in high-pressure moments. Strong technical skill, room to grow in delegation. These phrases sound tailored to the individual. They're actually close to universal manager feedback. Nearly every leader alive has been told, at some point, that they could delegate more, or that they come across as direct under pressure. The underlying feedback isn't fake, and the colleagues who gave it meant it sincerely. But the language it gets packaged into often borrows the exact same vague but flattering formula that made Forer's fake results feel 85% accurate to the people reading them. Fourth scenario, and maybe the most overlooked, astrology adjacent, team-type branding in corporate training. Some of these programs are explicit about the parallel. They'll literally use color wheels, animal totems, or elemental categories, the same underlying structure as a horoscope column, just repackaged with a corporate logo on the cover and a facilitator's certificate on the wall. Others are more subtle, using clinical-sounding labels and citing validated frameworks while still relying on statements broad enough to fit almost any employee in almost any department at almost any company on the map. The packaging changes from year to year. The mechanism underneath never does. If a personality framework's descriptions could be printed on a dozen different cards, shuffled, and handed out at random without anyone in the room noticing the swap, it isn't insight. It's branding wearing a lab coat. But here's the part nobody expects. The Barnum effect isn't a story about gullible people or obviously bad tests. It's a story about how confidently delivered vague language beats careful, specific truth almost every time, in almost every room, including rooms full of smart, skeptical, highly educated adults. Forer's subjects weren't fools. They were college students taking a real test seriously, filling it out honestly, expecting a real, individualized result. The effect doesn't require ignorance. It only requires belief that the statement was written for you, specifically. That's the one lever the whole thing runs on, and it's a lever that works on nearly everyone, including the managers running the workshop and signing the invoice for it. Here's a piece of it worth saying plainly, because it doesn't get said enough in corporate training rooms. The popularity of personality frameworks probably has less to do with their predictive power and more to do with how good they feel to receive. A flattering, complicated-sounding description of yourself is pleasant. Feeling understood by a glossy report is pleasant. Companies aren't necessarily buying insight when they buy these assessments. They're buying a controlled, professional-feeling dose of the same experience astrology provides, just with a PDF, a facilitator, and an invoice attached to it. None of this means personality assessments are worthless or that every framework out there is a scam. Some tools have real, measured validity, built on actual longitudinal data, tested against actual job outcomes, not just self-report satisfaction scores collected right after a fun workshop. The problem isn't that assessments exist. The problem is that most people, including most managers, can't tell the difference between a validated tool and a beautifully worded horoscope because both formats look nearly identical on the page. Confident, specific sounding, clean typography, a chart, a percentile, a color. Nothing on the printed report tells you which kind of tool you're actually holding in your hands. So what do you actually do with this? As a manager sitting across from a candidate's assessment results, or a report from a 360 review, or a slide deck from a team-building retreat, ask a harder question before you trust any of it as decisive. Would this specific statement be false for most people on my team? Take it out for a test drive. Suppose an assessment says a candidate is driven, but occasionally impatient. Run it through the filter. Would that statement be false for most of the people you already manage? Probably not. Most driven people get impatient sometimes. That means the statement carries almost no diagnostic weight. It's not describing this candidate specifically. It's describing ambition in general, applied to a stranger, dressed up as a private observation. Now compare that to a statement with actual teeth. Something like, in the last 2 client escalations, this person missed the internal deadline by more than a day both times. Run that one through the same filter. That statement could be false for most people on your team. Some people hit every deadline. Some miss one and recover fast. This one apparently missed 2 escalations in a row, specifically. That's a claim that could be wrong, which means it's a claim that's actually saying something. The Forer test and the could be false test are really the same test, just aimed in different directions. Vague statements survive the could be false question effortlessly by being true of basically everyone in the building. Real evidence doesn't survive it, because real evidence is specific enough to be wrong, anchored to a date, a project, a number. Try it a second way, on something closer to a 360 report. Struggles with delegation. Sounds like a finding. Ask the harder question. Would that be false for most managers in your company? Probably not. Most managers, at some point, hold on to a task longer than they should. Now compare it to reassigned 0 of the 11 action items from last quarter's Project Retro. That one is falsifiable, specific, and either true or not true. In a way, struggles with delegation never has to be, no matter how many people it's read aloud to in a review meeting. Run that filter on the next assessment result that crosses your desk, before it touches a promotion list, a team placement, or a hiring decision. If the statement would also apply to nearly anyone else in the room, file it as a flattering mirror, not a diagnosis. Save your trust for the statements that are specific enough to be provably wrong, the ones anchored to actual behavior, actual outcomes, actual dates. Those are the only kind of personality claims sturdy enough to bear real weight in a decision that affects someone's career, their income, and how they're seen by everyone around them. The takeaway for anyone managing people is simple, even if it's a little uncomfortable to sit with. Stop treating personality assessments as X-rays. Most of them are mirrors, and mirrors flatter, by design, every single time you look into one. Use them to open a conversation, never to close a decision. If a report's language could have been mailed to any employee in your building and still felt just as accurate, it hasn't told you anything about the person sitting in front of you. It's told you something about how persuasive, vague, well-worded confidence can be, on paper, in a boardroom, or in a fortune teller's booth. Hit follow if that surprised you.